What just leaked from Red Bull's 2026 engine program has sent the entire F1 grid into panic mode. Ferrari, Audi, and Honda have already filed complaints. Not because Red Bull cheated, but because their new engine exploits a compression trick so powerful, it could be untouchable under the current rulebook. And here's the twist: if the FIA doesn't shut it down in January, Red Bull gets to keep the trick for the entire 2026 season. But insiders say there's another problem brewing. If a last-minute ban hits, Red Bull's inexperience as a power unit manufacturer could trigger a total collapse before the first race in Bahrain. On the record, the FIA hasn't acknowledged the leak. No press release, no clarification request, no sudden amendment to the 2026 engine rules. The message to the public is simple: business as usual. But inside the technical briefings, it's anything but. Multiple power unit suppliers, namely Ferrari, Honda, and Audi, are now engaged in what insiders are calling preemptive protest positioning. That's not an official term, but in Formula One, the unofficial gestures often speak louder than statements. These teams have seen something in the leaked Red Bull data that's left them deeply unsettled, not because it breaks the rules, but because it exploits what the rules forgot to define. Red Bull Powertrains, formed just 3 years ago and now partnered with Ford, was expected to face teething problems in its first independent engine project. But this leak changes the narrative completely. Rather than showing a cautious or conservative design, the leak's simulations reveal a power unit built around thermal behavior, something no other team has dared to touch so aggressively. In other words, Red Bull hasn't just caught up. They may have leapfrogged everyone by inventing an engine philosophy no one else prepared for. And worse, they did it by playing perfectly within the current rule set. The FIA's engine regulations for 2026 were supposed to level the playing field. Simplified combustion architecture, capped fuel flow, balanced hybrid output between MGUK and thermal recovery. But in reducing complexity, the FIA made a critical mistake. They assumed combustion efficiency would follow conventional logic. Red Bull appears to have rewritten that logic. The leak shows a system that grows stronger under thermal stress, almost as if it's designed to use heat as fuel, rather than fight it. And that's the loophole: because the rules never explicitly forbid a system that gains efficiency under heat load, Red Bull may have created something unstoppable and untouchable. That's why rival teams are now in full containment mode. Publicly, they're staying quiet, avoiding any move that could tip their hand too early. Privately, they've already begun lobbying for an FIA directive. Not to ban Red Bull's engine outright yet, but to define the limits of combustion behavior before it's too late. Because if Red Bull finalizes and homologates this architecture before the rules evolve, the rest of the grid will be locked out of that concept for years. This isn't about catching up. It's about keeping the fight fair before the gun goes off in Bahrain. Ford's involvement complicates everything. This is their first return to F1 power since the Cosworth era, and the leak places their name in the middle of the biggest technical controversy since Ferrari's fuel flow system in 2019. Except this time, there's no suggestion of foul play. Just brilliant exploitation of regulatory silence. And that silence cuts both ways. Because if Ford's name becomes associated with an engine the FIA refuses to regulate, or worse, can't regulate, they gain enormous credibility. And credibility is currency when you're building a global performance brand. What's becoming clear to those watching closely is that Red Bull may not be reacting at all. They may have planned for this moment from the very beginning. Their entire engine strategy, thermal mapping, variable ignition timing, late-phase detonation control, seems tailored for a specific reading of the 2026 rulebook. It's as if they didn't just read the rules. They anticipated where they would fail. That kind of foresight doesn't come from panic. It comes from confidence. And if the FIA doesn't step in now, that confidence could become dominance. And yet, something still doesn't add up. The leak revealed a lot, but not everything. Key thermal data points were redacted. Simulation timestamps were incomplete. And there are whispers inside technical circles that the leaked model isn't even the final version. If that's true, then what the grid is panicking about now may only be stage one of a much deeper system. A system built not just to comply with the rules but to live inside them, while redefining what legal performance actually means. The leak didn't come through a journalist or a hacker. It came through routine compliance. In the early stages of power unit homologation, engine suppliers are required to submit anonymized simulation data to the FIA for analysis and verification. Somehow, likely through a shared technical loop, portions of Red Bull's simulation package were viewed by rival manufacturers. And what they saw wasn't alarming because of what was included, it was because of what should have been missing. The torque curves, thermal feedback loops, and mid-stint response maps all pointed to one chilling conclusion: Red Bull's engine behaves differently. Fundamentally differently. The first anomaly was noticed in a series of mid-load cycles. Instead of seeing power degradation as engine temperature rose, a standard trait in all internal combustion engines, the Red Bull model showed a reverse trend. Power didn't just remain stable, it increased. Slightly, almost imperceptibly. But enough. Enough to suggest a mechanism that was using thermal saturation not as a threat, but as a performance gateway. This wasn't a fluke. The behavior repeated across multiple runs, multiple conditions. The leak showed a system that responds to stress by unlocking more efficiency, more torque, more acceleration. That's when Mercedes reportedly ran simulations of their own. Taking Red Bull's output as a baseline, they attempted to replicate the effect using conventional engine mapping. The result? Failure. Not because the data was flawed, but because their own architecture couldn't replicate the behavior without violating energy limits or damaging the core engine design. In simpler terms, Red Bull had baked the trick into the structure itself. It wasn't a software cheat. It was a combustion system designed around the heat curve. And unless you built your engine around the same concept, you couldn't copy it. Not in months. Not in years. The most alarming element came from the combustion phasing data. According to internal sources, Red Bull's engine appears to deploy a delayed ignition strategy, possibly split-stroke, possibly pressure-reactive, that staggers ignition across a single piston cycle. The effect is a broadened pressure curve, which extends the mechanical work window during combustion without increasing fuel use or breaking thermal efficiency rules. It's like running a higher compression engine without the mechanical strain. The leak didn't show the full mechanics. But it showed just enough to convince rival teams that this wasn't theoretical. It was real. Audi's internal engineering review reportedly labeled the engine concept thermally parasitic, a system that not only survives thermal loading but exploits it to accelerate heat-induced performance mapping. Ferrari's evaluation was simpler. They called it a legal compression enhancer. But one term stood out above all others, used by a senior engineer at Honda: thermal trapdoor. Because once that secondary power curve activates, nothing else matters. You're behind, and you won't catch up unless your engine can fall through that same trapdoor under the same conditions. And no one else is close. Still, it's not just about the technical marvel. It's about the strategic timing. Because what the leak reveals is that Red Bull's design is nearly complete. It's not experimental. It's validated. This means their homologation clock is ticking. If the FIA doesn't act before Red Bull submits the final package, the engine becomes protected, locked in by regulation. And once it's locked, no directive can retroactively invalidate it without rewriting the rulebook mid-season. That's why Ferrari and Mercedes are pushing behind the scenes. Not to protest yet, but to force a preemptive clarification before Red Bull slams the door shut. But here's what's truly terrifying: the leak may have been controlled. A breadcrumb trail. Because some key data ranges were missing. Certain telemetry gaps. No electrical system overlays. If that was intentional, it means Red Bull might have shown just enough to stir panic while still holding back the real weapon. And if that's true, the rest of the grid isn't reacting to Red Bull's final engine. They're panicking over its shadow. This is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because unlike previous controversies like Mercedes' DAS or Ferrari's fuel flow bypass, there's no clear violation to chase. No component to examine, no procedure to question. Red Bull's 2026 power unit, based on every available detail in the leak, fits squarely within the framework the FIA built. Which means the very system designed to protect competition parity is now protecting the innovation that could destroy it. the FIA isn't chasing a cheat. They're chasing a ghost one made of numbers, interpretations, and regulatory silence. The crux of the problem lies in language. The 2026 engine regulations speak in absolutes: fuel flow, MGUK limits, battery output, exhaust recovery. But combustion behavior? That's described only in terms of efficiency targets and general emissions intent. There are no bans on specific thermal exploitation strategies. No restrictions on dynamic ignition mapping that reacts to engine temperature. And no clauses that forbid systems from growing stronger under duress. That wasn't an oversight, it was an assumption. An assumption that no one would be bold or clever or reckless enough to build a power unit around a loophole no one believed existed. So now, the FIA is trapped. If they issue a directive tomorrow, defining limits on temperature-reactive torque generation, they're not enforcing the rules, they're rewriting them. And rewriting rules after an innovation has emerged has historically triggered only two outcomes: either the system is banned outright, igniting political warfare, or it's grandfathered in, locking in an advantage no other team can legally replicate. Either way, the fallout is catastrophic. For competition. For credibility. For the image of technical neutrality that the FIA has tried to rebuild after years of perceived bias. What makes this worse is timing. Engine homologation begins within weeks. If Red Bull finalizes their design under the current wording, the system becomes protected, enshrined not by secrecy, but by procedure. And even if the FIA wants to act later, it would take consensus from the grid to change the rules mid-season. Which won't happen. Because by then, the teams most damaged by Red Bull's innovation will already be mathematically locked out of contention. That's the trap. If the FIA waits for proof on track, they'll be arriving at the crime scene after the championship has been stolen. The fear now inside the governing body isn't just that Red Bull found a gap. It's that they predicted it. That they've been working toward this engine design not in spite of the rules but because of them. That every line in the regulation was interpreted not as a limit, but as an invitation. And in that sense, Red Bull hasn't broken the system. They've exposed it. Exposed the fragile balance between encouraging innovation and controlling it. Exposed how quickly the line between genius and unfairness can disappear when the rulebook speaks in generalities and teams think in absolutes. This leads to the quiet conversations now unfolding between FIA officials and senior team representatives. What can be done without causing a scandal? What wording can be added that doesn't retroactively punish Red Bull, but also prevents others from following suit? Is there even a path forward that avoids a protest war before the 2026 season begins? Right now, the answer appears to be no. Every option comes with risk. And the longer the FIA waits, the more control they lose over how this story ends. Because in Formula One, hesitation is a decision in itself. And it's one that Red Bull appears to have counted on. And yet, there's one more layer that's keeping team principals awake at night: precedent. If Red Bull's thermal system is allowed to stand, what else becomes possible? What other teams will start chasing unregulated behaviors in areas the rules were never meant to govern? This leak might just be the beginning. A signal that the next generation of F1 isn't going to be about who can build the fastest car, but who can play 4D chess with the rulebook while the FIA tries to learn the game.